Hi, I'm Bill Niffen. Thanks for joining me for this entry of the Jesus Blog. Well, I'm back here in my law library today because we're going to examine the second of the big claims that we as Christians make, and that is that Christ was resurrected from the dead. There are a lot of people who say that, oh, that whole thing about the resurrection is just a myth. You can explain that away. It's no miracle. Well, after we look at the evidence today, I think it's going to be abundantly clear that the facts that we believe are true and that what we say about the resurrection is in fact right. It really truly was a miracle. Well, I submit to you Exhibit A. Let's go back and talk a little bit about what our scene is on Easter Sunday. Well, we know that Jesus Christ is dead. Our forensic pathologist told us that. We also know that Joseph had requested Christ's body. He and Nicodemus had wrapped cloths around it, put spices on him, laid him in Joseph's tomb, had rolled a stone in front of it. We know that the religious leaders were concerned about the disciples stealing Christ's body, so they get Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, to give them a guard to put in front of the tomb. And there's also a seal placed, meaning that anybody opening that seal has violated the law of Rome and faces Rome's wrath. Well, on that Sunday morning, an angel appears, and the angel rolls away the stone, and Christ is resurrected. And when that happens, those soldiers, professional soldiers, are so scared they begin to shake and they collapse like dead men. Well, a little bit later, Mary Magdalene shows up. And Mary Magdalene and the other Mary are there to prepare Christ's body for burial. They're going to anoint him. They expect him to be dead. When they get there, Mary sees an angel, and the angel asks her, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's not here, he's risen, just like he said he would." Mary's a little confused. The tomb's empty. She sees a man, and she runs up to him and starts to talk with him. Well, it turns out that it's Jesus. And Jesus tells her, "Go back and tell the disciples." So Mary runs back to Jerusalem, and she has to look for John and Peter. Why? Because they're in hiding. Ever since Christ got crucified, they are afraid they're next, so they're in hiding. They're trying to stay away from the religious leaders. Mary tells them what has happened. Well, John and Peter take off for the tomb. John gets there first, and he looks inside the tomb, and he sees Christ's grave clothes on a ledge where they laid his body. And just a little bit above that, on what would have been the headrest, is the napkin that they wrapped around his head. And what John notices is that these grave clothes are undisturbed. They're not strewn all over. They're not missing. They're right there, laying just like they would have been had Christ's body been in it. But his body's not. It's almost as if his body had just disappeared. And the napkin that was around his head is still, as the Greek tells us, twirled up. It's still wrapped. It's not been unwrapped. John's amazed. Well, Peter gets there a second or two later, and he actually goes into the tomb, and he sees these undisturbed grave clothes. He's amazed. John goes actually into the tomb and looks again, and he is amazed and begins to believe. Not sure what, but he begins to believe. Well, in the meantime, the guards go back to the city, and they tell the religious leaders what happened. The religious leaders are concerned. So they decide they're going to make a story. They offer to pay the soldiers money to lie and say that they were asleep while they were on duty, and that while they were asleep, the disciples stole the body. And if anything happens out of it, and the governor finds out, they'll go to bat and tell them what's going on. Now this is significant. Why? Because Roman soldiers that fell asleep on their post were executed. No questions asked. So the religious leaders are convincing these guys by paying them money to lie and say that the disciples stole Christ's body. Well, we have to address the issue of, is the tomb really empty? I submit to you Exhibit B. It's possible that the disciples and Mary and everybody else just went to the wrong tomb. Maybe they went to an empty tomb thinking that was the one where they buried Christ, but he was in a different tomb. Well, if that were the case, it would be very easy to disprove the resurrection. Why? Because when Peter and the other disciples began preaching Christ resurrected, all the religious leaders would need to do is say, "Hey, wait a minute, this is the tomb where his body is. Look, we'll roll away the stone and show you," and produce his body. If that had happened, Christianity would have ended. But they couldn't do it. Why? Because the body was gone. So what they did was they cooked up this story about the disciples stealing the body, which is another possible explanation for what happens to the body of Christ. But that doesn't make a lot of sense either. Think about the disciples' mental state when Christ is crucified. They're disappointed because Christ didn't come back and be the conquering hero that they thought that he would be and overthrow the Romans while he was still alive. They're discouraged because Jesus is dead. And last but not least, they look defeated. Why? Because the religious leaders in Rome have won out. They've killed Christ. Well, in addition to the fact that they have this mental state and really probably not too inclined to go get the body of Christ, they would have faced trained soldiers. And the disciples, as you'll recall, were fishermen, and one of them was a tax collector. These weren't men that were trained in military arts. They would have been facing a military unit that knew how to fight. There's no way that they had the courage at that point to confront those soldiers and try to steal the body. Well, there was also a claim that Jesus encountered his followers. Well, maybe that's a hallucination. Let's take a look at what the definition of hallucination. According to the Baker Encyclopedia of Psychology, a hallucination is a sensory experience such as seeing persons or objects, hearing voices and smelling odors in the absence of environmental stimuli. Basically, seeing, smelling, or hearing something that really isn't there. Our clinical psychology expert, Dr. Gary R. Collins, says that a hallucination is individualistic and cannot be shared because there's no way to transfer those experiences, those fake images, from the mind of one person to another. He also says that the hallucination is based on some sort of an expectation. Well, let's talk about the expectations and the experiences of the disciples with Christ after his resurrection. I submit to you Exhibit C. Well, the first encounter is between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. We know that her expectation is not Christ alive and resurrected, it's Christ dead. She's surprised to find the tomb empty. She thinks that somebody stole the body, which is why she talks to a man she thought at first was the gardener and says, "What have you done with his body?" Clearly not her expectation. Later in the day, Jesus appears to Peter. He also thinks that Christ has been crucified and is dead. He has no expectation that Christ is resurrected and alive. A little bit later, Jesus appears to the disciples without Thomas. We'll talk about Thomas in a minute. But without Thomas, they all think that he's dead. And not only does he prove them wrong about the fact that he's alive, they had the exact same encounter. So clearly, not only do they have an expectation he's dead, which is wrong, they also had the exact same encounter, clearly proving he's not a hallucination. Well, then there's Thomas. Thomas says, you know what? You guys may think that you saw Christ alive, but unless I can touch his hands and I can touch his side, I'm just not going to buy it. He is the first resurrection skeptic. Well, later on, Thomas is in the same room as the disciples, and Christ appeared. And Christ offers to let Thomas touch his hands and his side. And when Thomas does that, he falls to his knees and says, "My Lord and my God." His expectation was Christ was dead, so that's not a hallucination. Plus, all the disciples present see this happen. Clearly, they have the exact same experience. Clearly, this is not a hallucination. Well, we go on to the disciples walking to Emmaus. Jesus comes up to them, starts talking with them. They talk about how they were surprised that Jesus was crucified. They thought that he was the Messiah. And then when he blesses the food, they figure out who he is. They're surprised, and yet they have the exact same experience in spite of their expectation that Christ is dead. We get to the Sea of Tiberias. Jesus comes with the disciples have gone back to fishing. And when they come to the shore, Jesus has cooked some fish on a fire and has also made some bread. And he gives them the fish and the bread. They all have the exact same experience, that Christ is there, there's a fire, he has cooked food, and he feeds them. Clearly not the product of one person's imagination, a shared experience proving the reality of it. Last but not least, Jesus appears to 500 different believers on a mountain in Galilee. They all report the exact same encounter. Clearly not a result of a hallucination. This is a true, honest-to-goodness experience. We also have the testimony of the disciples. They go from a demeanor of cowardliness to a demeanor of courageousness. They are willing to stand up and proclaim Christ resurrected in spite of the persecution and opposition that they are going to face. In fact, 10 out of the 11 remaining disciples end up experiencing horrific deaths. Peter gets crucified upside down. Old Doubting Thomas himself, the original resurrection skeptic, gets boiled in oil, and yet not one of them ever says, "I'm not really sure if Christ was raised from the dead," or "that whole thing about resurrection we made up." Every one of them, to his dying breath, asserts that Jesus Christ was resurrected from the dead. So what conclusion can we draw from these experiences and this testimony? Well, I submit to you Exhibit D. Our conclusion, he is risen. He is risen indeed. The evidence is on our side. These facts are true. We can put our full faith and confidence in the fact that these things happen and that what we say about the resurrection is true. It is truly a miracle. And I'll tell you, that's a case that I would take to court any day of the week and twice on Sunday. Well, come back and join us next week when we will discuss the issue of Jesus is Lord. In the meantime, may God bless you and keep you, and may you have a closer walk.